these chronic cardiometabolic diseases that we see in our population, even potentially neurological diseases, immune disorders, I think the biggest driver is poor diet. By altering diet in people and using food as medicine, we can have a fundamental impact on the health of our nation and our world.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. In this episode, I have an interview with a leading scientist specializing in gut microbiota. These are the microbes that live in your intestine and help you digest your food. Interestingly, our DNA does not have all the enzymes we need to break down the food that we eat into vitamins and minerals that we need to survive. We actually live in this weird symbiotic relationship with our microbial ecosystem. Most of it is in our gut. Most of it lives in our bowels and our intestines. We provide the microbes a nice, warm, damp home, and they provide us with nutrients from the food that we give them. When the ecosystem gets out of whack, we can get sick. Sometimes we take antibiotics to cure an infection, and that throws a huge wrench into this internal ecosystem. I've read articles and seen folks saying that probiotics and yogurt help to rebuild this robust microbiome. I've also heard some folks saying that anything you eat gets killed in your stomach and has really no effect on your microbiome. I'd like to hear what the experts have to say. Listen along, and hopefully you'll also find out. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. Please share it with your friends, and feel free to interact with me, send me a review of the podcast, or join the Facebook group, The Rational View, and chat with me. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Professor Jack Gilbert joined UCSD in 2019, where he's a professor in Pediatrics and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Associate Vice Chancellor for Marine Science, and Director of both the Microbiome and Metagenomics Center and the Microbiome Core Facility. He uses molecular analysis to test fundamental hypotheses in microbial ecology. He co-founded the Earth Microbiome Project and American Gut Project, has authored over 400 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters on microbial ecology, co-authored the book Dirt is Good, and is the founding editor-in-chief of ASM Systems Journal. He founded Biomesense, Inc. to produce automated microbiome sensors. Dr. Gilbert, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you, Al.
So I appreciate you joining us here today to tell us about microbiomes. I've been looking at nutrition and health, and one of the things that I think is lacking in these discussions is the impact of microbiome on health. I kind of feel like the scientific community has only just scratched the surface on the role that the gut microbiome plays in health and disease processes. Would it be fair that it's kind of been an overlooked area of science until very recently?
Well, very recently, probably in the last 20 years. I mean, people have always understood, realistically, microbes in the body must be playing some kind of role in health. I mean, back in the 19th century, Louis Pasteur said that plants and animals probably couldn't survive without the microbes that lived within inside them. And then we had Eli Metchnikoff talking about the importance of fermented foods because it introduced foreign bacteria into the body and promoted health. And in the 1950s, people were using fecal microbiome transplants to cure disorders such as C. diff infections. So for 150 years, people have understood there's some role. It's really only in the last 20 years that we've had the technology in place to start to investigate the complexity of that microbiome in a way that would reflect our ability to do anything with it. Right? It's all very well saying, look, it makes a difference. Very different to be able to say, I can come up with targeted clinical therapies and predictive diagnostic biomarkers that I can use to actually treat specific diseases or diagnose particular conditions. And that is a modern innovation.
Is the ability to do genome sequencing a key tool in the arsenal for this work?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about the microbiome, right, we're talking about a collection of hundreds, sometimes thousands of species of microorganisms living across the body, right? Each one of them has a genome size of maybe between 2 to 8 million base pairs. Your genome is only 3.5 billion, so it's significantly larger, but you only have one of those in some 30 trillion cells of your body. There are some 40 trillion microbial cells in your body, and each one of them has 6 million base pairs on average in their genome. So it's an enormous quantity and variety of genetic information. Wow. And the only way that we can understand it is if we use DNA sequencing technologies to read it out and tell us who is there and what are they doing, and try and use that information to understand, are these organisms predictive of the disease that we observe in the patient? Are these organisms doing something metabolically, stimulating the immune response, changing your hormone levels, influencing your brain activity? Are they doing something that we can track down and use to identify a mechanism, right? We're like microbial engineers. Yeah. We want to figure out what they're doing.
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn that most of the cells in our body don't share our DNA. Like, we like to think we have an identity which is associated with our DNA, but, we really are mostly microbiome. How does this work? Why doesn't our immune system attack these other cells?
Well, we're swimming in a microbial world. So, over the last, say, 2 billion years of eukaryotic evolution of things that you can see with your eyes, right? That life has lived in a microbial planet. And microbes have been around for 4 billion years, so they outdate us by around 2 billion years. Our ape evolution is only around 5 to 10 million years old, and our bodies have evolved to manage that microbial exposure. From the moment your amniotic sac ruptures, you're continuously exposed to microorganisms, and you are a nice big sack of lovely nutrients in a nice warm cuddly environment, right? And they want to take advantage of that. Some microbes have actually adapted and evolved to mammalian physiology to just live alongside us. But they're really well adapted to our bodies. And so the immune system, I like to think of the immune system like a gardener. Traditionally we think of it like a soldier or an army, right? It's there to kill off the bad bugs, but it's really not. That's probably one very, very tiny role it has. It's more there to manage that garden, to make sure that the garden produces the right kinds of things to keep our body healthy.
So it's very selective.
Those microbial, super selective. And it's managing it. It's promoting the growth of the good guys and making the environment less advantageous for the bad guys. And that's a far more nuanced understanding of how the immune system functions. But, you're a donut, right? You've got the whole of your donut goes from your mouth to your anus. So that's all on the outside. Everything on your skin is on the outside. Your urogenital tract is on the outside. We have lots of invaginations into this physique, and those are colonizable because they're in contact with the outside world. You alone are emitting some 30 million bacterial cells into your immediate vicinity every hour.
Wow.
So you are a little microbial generator, right? Let alone, the microbes that live inside you and you're exposed to. But if we were sitting in the same room, we'd both be exposed to each other's microbes. And therefore the immune system has to cope with that. It has to manage that exposure.
I can see why people become very germaphobic, and with that picture in mind, it kind of makes you cringe a little bit. But I understand also that germaphobic behavior isn't good for us. I mean, there's obviously mutually beneficial symbiosis going on here between our bodies and the microbes that we are cultivating. What can you give us some examples of what key roles microbes play in our bodies?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's we can have an endless discussion about this, and every single day we seem to find something new. I mean, some of the obvious most key roles is they play a role in helping to break down the food that we can't break down, right? There's substrates that we eat, especially plant materials, that our bodies just are not designed to break down. And so those bacteria that live down deep inside your large intestine, inside your colon, they can break those plant materials down, those complex carbohydrates, fiber, for example. They break down that fiber, they ferment it, much the same way as you'd see bacteria fermenting milk to make yogurt or cheese, bacteria fermenting, or bacteria and yeasts fermenting stuff to make wine, grapes.
Oh, okay.
These relationships, they break down these complex carbohydrates in our intestine, and they produce compounds as a byproduct, right? They're eating it, and then they poop out chemicals that our bodies become dependent on. The cells that line your intestine, that make your intestine function, they're called colonocytes. They line the colon, right? These cellular cells of the colon, they actually require these chemical poops that the bacteria produce when they degrade your fiber. And if they don't get it, they become, or the membrane that lines your colon can become weak. It can become permeable, way too permeable. And stuff that lives inside your intestine probably shouldn't really get inside your body. That's the whole point of having this membrane on the outside. It's supposed to stop those things happening.
Yeah, I've recently read a bit about links between the microbiome and like autoimmune disorders such as irritable bowel disease, for example. And I think you've been involved with a little bit of this, or you're certainly aware of it. Can you tell us a little bit about those links that perhaps you're discussing now?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two conditions there, really. There's inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, right, which is a pretty well recognized autoimmune disorder that, we believe the microbiome plays a role. People with IBD tend to have bacteria that tend to promote inflammation in the bowel. And there's a bidirectional relationship there. We're not sure which comes first, if it's the bacteria or the disease. Could be that the disease promotes bacteria, which promote the disease, and some kind of horrible negative feedback loop, right? And then you have things like irritable bowel syndrome, which is much more complex etiology. It's a broader range of disease, more like a spectrum, right? Tends to affect people in middle age, but can hit people across the gradient, and that is a much more complicated relationship. We've found maybe 7 or 8 different variations of IBS, and each one tends to have its own microbial signature that we find in the poop, right? So we don't really fundamentally understand necessarily, again, in that situation, which comes first, but we do know that those bacteria we find associated with those different IBS, they're all tend to be involved in promoting inflammation, promoting irritation of the membranes, and also causing even more distal dysfunction. So the metabolites they produce could break down your circadian function in your body, in the organs of your body, and can promote obesity. They can also influence things like how much insulin and incretin you secrete, so it could change your blood sugar and lead to diabetes. So there's very, very diverse and complicated relationships we don't understand. But what we do know is that you can treat it to a certain extent. I mean, there are quite a few small but powerful clinical trials that have demonstrated for both IBD and IBS that replacing that microbiome inside the gut with what we refer to as a fecal microbiota transplant, like I mentioned earlier in the 1950s, you take the poop from a healthy person and put it into somebody with IBS or IBD, and there is some evidence that it can play a role in helping to alleviate symptoms. But you do get, interestingly, responders and non-responders. Some people, you give them an FMT and their IBS symptoms go away, and other people, it doesn't appear to help. So we're still trying to figure out the impact and the efficacy of this treatment, and see what role it could play.
Yeah, the interventions are very gross, I guess, at this level. You're just kind of, this works, let's throw it in here and see if it, you're not, are you actually picking out individual strains or ecosystems of bacteria and implementing them? Or are you just taking, this is a healthy person, we'll put it into an unhealthy person and see if it works? Like, what level are we at with these interactions?
I mean, yeah, for FMT, it really is the latter, right? We just kind of, it's almost like this ecosystem is damaged. Let's take this ecosystem we don't understand and just throw it at that ecosystem and hope it replaces the damaged one. There are a couple of new microbiome associated drugs that have been approved by the FDA recently, and these are far more targeted. They contain, they're pills often, or either oral or suppository, that contain particular strains of bacteria, which appear to play a role in doing the same thing as a total FMT. So, instead of having just the poo, we've just taken some of the bugs out of the poo, cultivated them, and those bugs appear to play a role in helping to treat disease. They're only really approved for Clostridioides difficile infections, so C. diff infection, chronic pathogenic disease of the gut. But they appear to be effective. So we're working on getting from this very crude, we don't really understand what's happening, but if we swap out your poop for somebody's healthy's poop, you're going to get better, to a far more targeted approach where we have particular probiotics, if you will, right? When we introduce them at an appropriate amount in a live form, they appear to have a health benefit, the definition of a probiotic. And so we are working towards these more discrete, targeted therapeutics.
I know antibiotics play havoc with our microbiome. If you take an antibiotic for an infection, I imagine it cleans out the gut microbiome, and you're kind of starting anew with an empty gut. And I've read that probiotics, eating yogurt or taking orally these probiotics are supposed to help reestablish your gut microbiome after antibiotics. But I've also read people saying that eating probiotics doesn't do much at all to your gut, because anything that goes in the stomach dies. How do you get around this? What's the evidence say?
Right. So, number one, antibiotics do have an impact upon the microbiome, right? That's what they're designed to do. They kill off certain species of bacteria, certain types of bacteria. So that's a given. But invariably, you can't kill it all off. And as soon as you stop taking the antibiotics, as long as you're eating healthily and you have a reasonably healthy lifestyle, your beneficial microbes that are still present inside the crypts and the ducts of your intestine, inside your skin, inside your oral cavity, they come bouncing back quite happily, right? You give them the right kinds of substrates, healthy, colorful, fiber-rich diet, and they'll come bouncing back quite happily. The probiotics in food, they're not designed to live in the intestine. None of them are. They won't survive. It'd be like throwing a house plant into the Amazon and just assuming it was going to take over. There's just no way. There's one study from Israel where they did oral endoscopy and colonoscopy. So took samples from both ends of people, and they put them on antibiotics, and they gave them probiotics, in a subset of that population. And a small subset of the people that took probiotics in the duodenum, which is this region of the gut just after the stomach, those probiotics actually started to take up residence there, which they definitely shouldn't be doing, right? They couldn't survive in the rest of the intestine, but they shouldn't be taking up residence there. We don't think that that's a good thing, right? Food-based bacteria shouldn't be taking up residence in the gut. So this suggests that in some people, if they were to take a probiotic as a treatment for trying to recapitulate the gut microbiome, it could have unintended consequences. We don't know if they're bad, right? Okay. But maybe, we want our beneficial microbes to come back. This is what I always say. If you need to take an antibiotic, just try and eat healthy when you're taking the antibiotic, and for at least 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, right? To allow your microbial community to come back healthy and strong. Okay. It's never wiped out. You can never get a clean slate, right? It's they're impossible to eradicate entirely. they're resilient.
Okay, that's very helpful, because I think there's a lot of mixed messages out there, and people are selling these probiotics I've seen it. You take antibiotics, take your probiotics to recolonize your gut. No. Okay, this is very useful.
No evidence to support that. Yeah, there's no evidence to support that that's a good idea, and no evidence to suggest that it has any real benefit. I'll tell you what probiotics, what I think they do, right? There's, for years, when I say years, I mean, thousands of years of our human culture, we've consumed fermented foods, right? And our immune systems of our ancestors were almost selected for based upon our, healthy response to those foods, because that was the way we preserved food, right? So ancestrally, our immune systems have got used to seeing these complex, biologically alive microorganisms in the food that we consume. So when we stop consuming those things, we hypothesize that can lead to immune irregularity. We think, I emphasize, we don't have the data for this. We can't go back in time and find out what's going on, but it does appear that this is what happens.
Okay.
When we add those fermented food, those living bacteria back into our body, we see healthy immune responses. What do I mean by that? Like the immune system tends to have reduced systemic negative inflammation when you consume probiotic, but importantly, fermented foods that have living organisms in them. So, eating that kimchi, eating that sauerkraut, consuming the kefir, consuming yogurts, all these things we believe can be beneficial because our immune system is expecting to see them. We talked about the immune system being like a gardener. Another brilliant thing it's a surveillance network. So your immune system underneath your skin is sensing all of these microbes that it sees on the outside of your skin, because little bits of those microbes break off and we think get through the barrier, and our immune system sees them and keeps a record of what it sees. And it will do the same for those foods that are passing through your mouth, down your esophagus, into your stomach, into your duodenum. It will see the bacteria and the fungi and the viruses that are associated with that fermented food. It will see the food itself, and it keeps a record of it inside your body. And it seems that the bacteria that predominantly are associated with fermented food are sensed by that immune system, and they produce a positive immune phenotype. Your immune system looks healthier. Seems like it might be a good idea.
That's very interesting. In fact, I've read that, as you mentioned, so that the microbiome is linked to metabolism rate and potentially to obesity. And so, is it possible that we seem to be seeing an epidemic of obesity in North American culture, and people aren't exactly sure what it is. Is it access to processed food? Is it access to sugars? Is it less access to alive foods like these fermented foods? Does that play a role in obesity?
It's complicated, but I'd say it's all of the above, right? We know if I take a mouse, right, and I take away all of its bacteria, we can create a germ-free mouse. We do this very, very complicated. It's quite very difficult, but you can create a mouse which has no bacteria living inside it. No matter what I feed that bacteria, no matter what I feed the mouse, as long as I give it the same number of calories, if I give it a healthy, fiber-rich diet or an unhealthy, high sugar, high saturated fat diet, as long as I give it the same amount of calories, it will put on the same amount of weight. But if the mouse has bacteria inside it, and I give it a fiber-rich diet or a high sugar, high saturated fat diet, that high sugar, high saturated fat diet will promote obesity at the same calorific intake compared to a fiber diet, right? Suggesting that this high sugar, high saturated fat diet changes the microbiome in a way that promotes obesity. What's more interesting is if we feed the mouse a high sugar, high saturated fat diet, right, and then we take that microbiome out of that mouse and put it into a mouse that's never seen a high sugar, high saturated fat diet, that mouse will now become obese as well.
Wow.
So The diet changes which bacteria can thrive and survive, because remember, what you eat is feeding your microbiome, right? Changes those bacteria, and then those bacteria promote obesity. We've demonstrated quite successfully, for example, that the bacteria that are changed by that high sugar, high saturated fat diet, right? Those bacteria produce chemicals which can alter how your body processes food energy, causing it to put more of that energy into storage, visceral fat,
Wow.
Versus the other way where it's burning it up due to respiration. And it can do that for the same amount of calories as, say, a high fiber diet. It's obviously way more complicated than that, but I will argue that the biggest driver of these chronic cardiometabolic diseases that we see in our population, even potentially neurological diseases, immune disorders, I think the biggest driver is poor diet. I really do think that by altering diet in people and using food as medicine, we can have a fundamental impact on the health of our nation and our world.
And in terms of the most important aspects of diet for a healthy gut microbiome, you've mentioned fiber as a key thing for the bacteria in the large colon. What would you say is incorporated in a healthy diet for the microbiome?
Well, okay, so broad strokes. Let me take a step back. I think it varies per person.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I think there are individualized responses to food. Well, in fact, I know based upon all of the clinical data that we've seen and the trials that have been run. And the trial, we're currently running a new trial right now called the Nutrition for Precision Health Program. It's a $170 million NIH program, National Institutes of Health program, that's designed explicitly to see why people vary in their response to diet. But, broad strokes, what's a healthy diet? It's one that's definitely rich in fiber, but not just one type of fiber. It's not like you should just go out and buy fiber pills in the supermarket and just start chowing down on those. Okay. You need to eat a diverse array of fibers. Our American Gut Project, which we published in 2018, demonstrated quite effectively that people who didn't tend to report disease had a very high diversity of beneficial chemicals in their bloodstream, and also had a highly diverse and health-promoting microbiome, tended to consume more than 30 different species of plant in a week.
Wow.
So this is an association, but that's a good one, right? Eat 30 different species of plant in a week. And remember, cabbage and Brussels sprouts and broccoli are all one species, right? So you got to think about it better. They're all brassica, right? That's all the same species, just different parts of the plants that have been selected for. But you got to think about it. So, we talk about eating the rainbow. That's key. All of those colorful chemicals you find in the food that make them so pretty, like blueberries and raspberries and, and strawberries and your rhubarb, etc. Those chemicals are actually food for the bacteria and they can promote the growth of beneficial organisms. So those high amount of fiber, but also a diverse array of fibers, great. Colorful foods, great, right? The one other addition, the one thing one of my colleagues, Justin Sonnenberg, demonstrated in a recent paper was that sometimes the gut microbiome in a person needs to be primed to receive these kind of nutrients, right? To get ready for them. And that's where that fermented food comes in. We think things like kombucha, things like sauerkraut, they can play a beneficial role in helping to stimulate the immune system. Remember, the immune system is the gardener. So those things stimulate the immune system. That immune system promotes the growth of the beneficial organisms. And those beneficial organisms are then ready to receive the high fiber and highly colorful food diet, right? And then that all comes together to promote health from within.
Wow. Okay, that's very helpful information. And definitely the root of what I'm trying to understand in this series of podcasts is to figure out, what are the real evidence-based techniques that we can follow to help with health and nutrition. Another thing I'm interested in, and I've heard a little bit about it, is gut-brain links in that. And I think this has maybe some association with irritable bowel syndrome as well, but there are some aspects of how your gut responds to food that affect, your brain or your hormones or these things. Can you tell us a little bit about what is known about how the microbiome affects our brains?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's self-evident that the microbiome changes in the microbiome appear to be associated with everything from neurodevelopment, how the brain and how your behavior and health, mental health develop over your life, right? And neurodegeneration, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's or cognitive decline, where the brain is starting to fail, and things like depression and anxiety all appear to be associated with changes in the microbiome. We also know that, most central nervous system disorders like depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, are also associated with disturbances in gut transit. So things like diarrhea or constipation. So we'd say that that's a comorbidity, right? When you tend to have problems like depression, you're going to have gut problems at the same time. We also know that antibiotics, things that kill off bacteria, right? They tend to be associated in certain people with promoting depression and anxiety, but antivirals and antifungals do not. There's no association. So killing off certain bacteria may promote depression and anxiety. We also know, wonderfully, that you can take the take the microbiome from someone with major depressive disorder, take that microbiome in a fecal microbiome transplant, put it into an animal, like a mouse or a rat, and that mouse or rat will show disturbed mental behavior.
Wow.
And we can even do it between mice and rats. So we did a recent study where we took rats that show depression-like phenotypes. These rats don't crave sugar, right? We call this anhedonia as opposed to hedonistic. These are not hedonistic, right?
Okay.
They're just like, I don't want to eat anything nice. And they tend to be very lethargic and they don't tend to want to socialize. They show symptoms that are similar to human symptoms of depression.
Wow.
If we take a microbiome from a rat that doesn't have those symptoms and put it into a rat that does, we can alleviate those symptoms, via a fecal microbiome transplant. So this all suggests that the microbes inside your intestine are playing a role in what goes on up here.
Wow.
Well, how is that? We think that the bacteria produce chemicals which stimulate nerves that invenerate and go inside the gut, and they send signals up to the brain via our nervous system, and they change brain chemistry up here. Also, those bacteria can promote inflammation, local inflammation in the intestine, but that can go systemic, right? And you can get inflammation spreading throughout the body, and that can cause inflammation on the brain, right? So you get neuroinflammation, and neuroinflammation tends to be associated with depression, for example, right? And then there are many other little myriad ways in which things can change. So we do think, based on all the evidence that we have, that just changes or disturbances in the microbiome can promote changes in brain chemistry and therefore mental health. And we do think that if you can alter the microbiome to one that's not associated with depression, you can alleviate those brain chemical disturbances and therefore mental health disturbances.
Okay, wow, that's very interesting. So, is this becoming mainstream, or are we just at the level of discovery now? And should we be expecting to see treatments for depression and for obesity coming out of microbiome science soon?
Yeah, we're trying. Most of the work is still in animals and in association studies in humans. We did launch a company called Holobiome approximately 4 years ago, that is trying to commercialize bacteria that we've shown to be associated with an absence of major depressive disorder, and that when we introduce these bacteria into mice and rats, it can alleviate these conditions. Much the same way as we were talking about precision probiotics for treating things like C. diff infection or IBD maybe, we're trying to develop precision probiotics to treat depression, right? I do have a commercial interest in that company. But, Holobiome's entire program is to try and identify these organisms and get them into a clinical trial, which should be starting early next year. We are also involved in fecal microbiome transplants between healthy lack of poor mental health people, people without major depressive disorder, and people with depression disorder. And so we demonstrated in a very early phase clinical trial that it can alleviate certain symptoms of depression, having an FMT in this way. So we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're definitely not mainstream. We definitely shouldn't be trying to use these things at this time to treat depression, because we still have to prove it works.
Sure.
We've got to prove that it's not, it's not just snake oil, right? That's the really important piece about science.
Yes.
It takes time. We have to be careful because people's lives, expectations are on the line here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really interesting, right? In our rat studies, some of these bugs can be as effective at treating depression-like symptoms as ketamine. Ketamine has become a major new antidepressant that people are using all the time in the clinical setting. And so what would you prefer to take, a chemical antidepressant or just rebalance your microbiome? This one seems a lot more, less invasive.
Yeah.
Less
side effects.
Less immediate. Less side effects. I would prefer to create better equilibrium in the body, much the same way as we try and do with a healthy diet, rather than just trying to mask symptoms with a chemical which suppresses signatures.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
I think
for sure
it's important to try and get back to health.
Mm-hmm. And now you mentioned that some of these treatments are targeted probiotics, but you've also said that you can't eat food and get probiotics down there. How do you target the probiotics to where they should go? Do you inject them directly, or what's?
Oh, no, you can eat food. So you mentioned before that the people are worried that the probiotics are killed by the stomach acid. That's not true. It just doesn't happen. The bacteria don't survive very well inside the intestine, but they definitely go into the body, and the immune system sees them, right? Immune system doesn't kill them off; it just observes them, and that very state of surveillance tends to promote a healthy immune system. But most of those probiotics just go in all the way through and are passed out with your stool, right? So it's less about trying to get a targeted probiotic into the right place. It's more about getting the right kind of bacteria which have the right kind of immune signatures on the outside that stimulate the immune system in precise ways. We think that those could be playing a role in treating the condition. Think about it this way. If you had a surveillance system, and I'm not very good at analogies, but the immune system sees every single bacteria in a different way. And the way it sees the bacteria change how it responds and reacts. So a particular bacteria can stimulate the immune system to do particular things.
Wow.
Right? So if we add the right kind of bacteria in the right concentrations at the right time, we can train the immune system or push the immune system to do different things, such as suppress neuroinflammation. Just so happens some of these bacteria also produce things like neurotransmitters inside the intestine, which we think could play a role in gut transit, in how fast the gut moves, but also maybe in changing the signatures, the nervous system impulses which go from your gut to your brain. We just find that very hard to prove, right? But definitely stimulating the immune system in particular unique ways, we think, is a fundamental role for health.
That's actually a little bit of news to me because, as you mentioned, my picture of the immune system is soldiers, right? Their one thing is to kill. What other things does the immune system actually help certain bacteria, or is it just ignore them and leave them alone and let them live?
No, it actually coats the bacteria in little markers. So it coats some of the bad bacteria in lots of markers and targets them for removal, much as a gardener would go in and say, those are weeds, I don't want them here. They're going to interrupt my potatoes and tomatoes, right? Or potatoes and tomatoes, whatever. That the gardener would identify those and try and get rid of them. The other ones, it labels as, puts a little marker in there and says, this is my tomato plant. I want to keep it alive, right? And it might even put a little net around it and make sure it doesn't get eaten by something else. The immune system protects certain organisms.
Wow.
And it can produce chemicals which help to stimulate their growth or change their function and make them release certain compounds. this is all very, very new science, right? And a lot of it's still unpublished. But we tend to see the body and the immune system working in synergy, because they are the same thing, right? Yep. Your immune system's just part of your body, producing chemicals into the gut which stimulate certain growth of certain organisms. We see this, for example, with bile acids. So your body pumps bile acids out of your bile duct into your gut in order to theoretically break down food. But many of those bile acids are food for different types of bacteria. And the bacteria that consume some of those bile acids produce compounds which promote health in your pancreas, in your liver, in your kidneys, in your gastrointestinal membranes, all over the body.
Wow.
We're seeing these distal effects outside of the gut when the body produces this nutrients, fertilizer, if you will, to get the bacteria to produce the right kinds of chemicals. The body is clever. It's figured out a way to harvest the metabolic products from all of these organisms that it's constantly exposed to and it can't get rid of, right? It's like, well, I've got to live with them. So if I've got to live with them, I'm going to figure out a way to take advantage of them and feed myself with their products. It's very clever.
How does the immune system know which ones are good and which ones are bad? Is it looking at their products, or is there some sort of evolved genetic programming that, recognizes certain functional groups on these cells?
Both, but it's definitely the latter, right? The wonder of natural selection. Your immune system has evolved over tens, if not hundreds, of millions of years. And it's, through trial and error, it's figured out that if you will, that certain molecular signatures are associated with death, and therefore you don't produce any offspring. And other ones are associated with life, and therefore you do produce a lot of offspring, and those ones propagate in the population. This is evolution. So you're absolutely right. It's derived evolution. I mentioned before, this is one of the reasons we think that what our ancestors' immune systems were exposed to, and their immune responses to the environment play a fundamental role in how our bodies and how we respond and react to the world, to our diet, to pollen and animal dander outside, to pollution in the atmosphere. The whole idea of the hygiene hypothesis, right? Our bodies were used to seeing lots and lots and lots of immune stimulants in our environment, lots of bacteria, lots of viruses, lots of things,
sure.
Right? And then suddenly there's nothing. You're cut off from all of that, living in a sterile world. Your immune system's going to do strange things. It's not used to that. It's not evolutionarily used to that. Your ancestors' immune systems are there, and they gave birth to you because they had a particular type of immune response.
Yeah,
and you have to kind of live with that.
It's actually a very interesting perspective, and I assume your book "Dirt is Good" probably discusses that in some detail. But I remember, when you have children, you go to the hospital and they say, okay, well, you have to sterilize all of the bottles that you give your child, and you can't have any potential for infection here. So young parents are being taught at hospitals to bring up their kids in sterile environments. And I think what the science is showing is that's not necessarily the case. I don't know where the dividing line is, whether you should ignore. I would never say ignore what the doctors are telling you, because obviously the doctors know what they're doing. But I was always confused by, or maybe less strongly sterilizing everything as I learned more about this, right?
I think it's balance. So, the reason we don't have massive quantities of infectious disease killing 50 to 60 million American children every year like we did in the late 19th century and early 20th century, partly due to, majority due to vaccines, right? Partly due to cleaning up our environment so we're not living and consuming our fecal waste, right? And therefore having a hive to spread disease. And so ensuring that we're not exposed to pathogens is definitely a good idea, right? You don't want your child dying of a major pathogenic infection. But then it's outside of that, it's really tricky, right? Where are those pathogens coming from? Majority of them come from interaction with other people or from spoiled food, right? So that you do have to be clear, right? You can get Campylobacter on chicken, you can get, salmonella from eggs. You got to understand how to treat food carefully. Your ancestors knew that. You have to know that, right? That's a given way.
Sure.
You have to be mindful of the fact that other people can infect you. SARS-CoV-2 hopefully drilled that into most people's heads quite clearly, right? A virus can be transmitted from you to me, and I could get sick and die. Outside of that, you need to still maintain exposure. Your immune system needs to be trained. And so, where are you not going to find a lot of disease or the high probability of disease? Well, out in the garden, right? Or out in the park, or, even down on the beach, messing around in the environment. Children that physically interact with a puppy or a dog, right, when the child is under the age of 1, if they're allowed to continually physically interact with the dog, they have a 16% reduction in the likelihood of developing asthma. That's pretty big, right? That's quite a considerable impact, just being able to physically interact with the dog. And so we think that microbial exposure and immune stimulation they get from physically interacting with that dog when they're a baby, right, plays a fundamental role in training their immune system and allowing their bodies to develop. If they grow up on a farm, it's a 50% reduction. And that's huge. Growing up on a farm means that your probability of developing asthma is very, very much lower. Like only 1 to 2% of people that grow up on a farm develop asthma, whereas the US average is about 8 to 9%, right? But there's other aspects that we're only just starting to understand. Allow your child to physically interact with animals. Get out there in the dirt. Teach them how to garden so their immune system can become better gardeners.
That's very good advice. And just a little bit curious about your bio. You are working on something called Biomesense. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of what that is and what it does?
Yeah, our role as microbiologists working in clinical sector is to try and understand how the microbiome interacts with the body, right? And unfortunately, the only way to really do that when we're looking at the gut microbiome is to collect fecal matter, which isn't an ideal representation of what's going on inside the body, but it's like a late breaking news report, right? It's just whatever the press picked up. It's not necessarily the absolute truth. However, it's the best thing we have, and we produce it, most of us, daily, sometimes twice daily. We want to capture all of those things. When we look at the microbiome, it's incredibly complicated, right? If we think of something like your blood sugar level or your blood pressure or your heart rate, those are very simple measurements. It's usually one number, one measurement, and those tend to vary quite frequently. Things like your height and weight don't tend to vary very frequently. They change, but very slowly, right? And they're still simple numbers. Your genome is incredibly complicated, right? There's 28,000 genes in there, and how it's managed and run is incredibly complicated, but it's pretty static. It doesn't change very much.
Okay.
So, those are all measurements we use for health. Your microbiome is terrible, right? It's incredibly complicated, very diverse, but also dynamic. It changes over time, like your heart rate does. So we need to measure that. So we built a device that goes into your bathroom where you can take a piece of used toilet tissue after you've wiped yourself, dump it in the machine, and it extracts all the genetic information from the microbes and gives us a signature that allows us to see how your microbiome changes day to day. And so we're putting this device, we call it the Gut Lab, right? It's an entire molecular biology laboratory. It's basically my lab put into a box, which sits in your bathroom. Take my lab, put it in your bathroom, right? It's kind of weird. And what it allows us to do is we integrate this into clinical trials so that now whenever person going through a clinical trial, we're giving a drug intervention or a dietary intervention, we know exactly how their microbiome has changed over time. Okay. And so now, if I take all of that data, this huge database that we're building out of the gut labs that we're putting into clinical trials, I can now use that information using artificial intelligence to predict which of the change signatures reflects changes in the potential for a disease state or changes in how you might respond to a diet. So we're using this information to create better predictive algorithms so that we can use the microbiome as a biomarker of disease.
Very cool. That's amazing stuff. And this has been a really interesting discussion. And I've learned so much about how this is working and where it's going. Can you tell us maybe what we should look for coming up? What's the next big thing we should expect out of microbiome science?
One thing we're really, really interested in is understanding how the microbiome interacts with our endocrine system, our hormones, right? So we're fundamentally, one of our big new project areas is understanding both the microbiome and how it influences menopause. So looking at ways of decreasing the negative symptoms associated with menopause and improving women's health as they age. But then also, interestingly, in trans people. So especially trans men, for example, where they're taking testosterone to suppress the biological female side to create a new gender-based identity, they suffer physiological symptoms very similar to menopause. So we're trying to understand how the microbiome, what role the microbiome plays in these symptoms, so that we can use that information to help treat these disorders that affect 51% of our population, or 52% if you include trans people. So we're really interested in trying to figure out strategies to manipulate the microbiome to improve women's health overall.
Okay, that's very cool. So we'll keep an eye out for those results. And I'm really excited to hear about some of the treatments you're talking about coming to fruition and being available to the general public. I think this is really promising work and looking forward to.
I think one of the things I'm most interested in, and the thing that everybody should take away is your mother was probably right? Eating a healthy diet is probably one of the most fundamental things you can do to maintain health. You know, everything in moderation, but eating a healthy diet really will be life-changing. As you age, it will help potentially reduce cancer rates. It will help improve mental health. It will help with immune disorders. Eating a healthy diet, rich in fermented foods, eating the rainbow, eating more fiber can only be beneficial.
And diversity in those species is very important too, which is something I've learned. So
more than 30 different species of plant a week.
Very good. So thank you very much for coming and chatting with us today. For spending your time, I'll send you a Rational View t-shirt so you can remember your time with us.
Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.